They had him in handcuffs. They had him in an orange jumpsuit sitting behind a defendant's table in a courtroom that smelled like mildew and broken promises. They had a file full of planted evidence, a compliant prosecutor, and years of getting away with exactly this kind of thing. Detective Brad Collins leaned back in his chair, arms folded, wearing the quiet smirk of a man who had already written the ending. He had no idea, not the faintest whisper of a clue, that the man sitting in those handcuffs had been waiting for this exact moment for years, and that the ending Brad Collins had written was about to be shredded, set on fire, and buried. Events unfolded quietly as Derek Thompson drove a rented black Audi A6 through the Riverside district of Macon, a mid-sized metropolis in Georgia that looked respectable from the highway, but rotted from the inside once you got past the welcome signs. He was wearing a navy wool coat, a silver watch his late father had left him, and a calm expression that never changed regardless of what was happening around him. Those who knew Derek well said his face was like still water. You could not tell the depth by looking at the surface. He stopped at a red light at the intersection of Poplar and 9th. A police cruiser pulled up beside him. The light turned green. Derek drove exactly 3 blocks before the cruiser's lights exploded behind him, red and blue strobing through the fog like a warning from something ancient. He pulled over. He placed both hands on the steering wheel in plain sight. He kept his breathing even. He had done this before. Every black man in America has done this before. The officer who approached his window was Detective Brad Collins, though Derek would not learn the man's full name until later. What he saw in that first moment was a wide-shouldered white man in his mid-40s, jaw set with a particular kind of arrogance that grows when authority goes unchecked for too long. Brad Collins had been with the Macon Police Department for years. He had received commendations, complaints that disappeared before they were investigated, and one internal affairs file that had been sealed under circumstances nobody wanted to talk about. Behind Brad, a second officer climbed out of the passenger side. This was Detective Scott Riley, younger, with close-cropped red hair and eyes that darted around too much. The eyes of a man who was always calculating exits. Scott had been Brad's partner for years. Everyone in the department knew that wherever Brad went, Scott followed. And wherever Scott followed, things had a way of going badly for people who could not protect themselves. "License and registration," Brad said. "Not please, not sir, not good evening." Just the 3 words, clipped and final, like he was already bored with the transaction. Derek handed over both documents without comment. Brad studied them with the exaggerated slowness of a man performing authority rather than exercising it. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why I was stopped?" Brad's eyes went flat. "Broken tail light." "Step out." The tail light was not broken. Derek had checked the car when he picked it up from the rental agency that afternoon. He checked everything. He always checked everything. He stepped out anyway. What happened in the next minutes happened fast, and with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times. Scott Riley moved to the passenger side of the Audi, while Brad kept Derek standing by the driver's door. Then Brad said he was going to conduct a pat-down for officer safety. Derek submitted, and during those seconds when Derek's hands were on the roof and Brad's hands were moving along his sides, Scott Riley reached into the rental car's glove compartment and placed something there. A small vacuum-sealed bag containing what appeared to be approximately 40 grams of cocaine. When Brad walked around, opened the passenger door, looked inside, and said slowly and with theatrical surprise, "Well, I'll be damned." Derek Thompson's expression did not change. The still water did not ripple. He was arrested. He was handcuffed. He was read his rights in a tone that suggested the officer saying them found the whole procedure tiresome. He was placed in the back of the cruiser. And as the car pulled away, Brad Collins glanced in the rearview mirror at the man in the back seat and said to Scott quietly, almost cheerfully, "Another one off the street." Scott laughed, and Derek Thompson, sitting in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him and his silver watch pressing into his wrist, looked out at the fog-wrapped streets of Macon and thought, "Good. Now we begin." The Macon Police Department's holding facility smelled like bleach and despair in equal measure. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that seemed specifically designed to erode a person's sense of time. Derek was processed, photographed, fingerprinted, stripped of his watch, his phone, his wallet, and his coat. The officer doing intake, a bored young man named Corporal Ethan Parker, typed everything into the system with the mechanical disinterest of someone filling out a grocery order. While Ethan typed, Brad Collins stood at the counter and talked. He talked the way men talk when they have stopped being afraid of consequences, loosely, with their chest out, filling silence with the sound of their own certainty. 40 grams, Brad said to nobody in particular. That's intent to distribute. The DA is gonna love this one. Clean arrest, clean evidence, no complications. Scott was leaning against the wall, scrolling his phone. What's his story? He say anything? Not a word. Just stared at me the whole ride like he was memorizing my face. Brad snorted. Let him stare. It does not matter what he memorizes where he is going. Derek was placed in a holding cell. The cell contained 3 other men, a young kid who was clearly terrified, an older, heavy-set man who was asleep on the bench and snoring, and a wiry man with a tattoo on his neck who studied Derek for a moment before nodding once and returning to his business. Derek sat down on the bench, rested his arms on his knees, and waited. He had been preparing for this for years. Let us be precise about who Derek Thompson was, because the courtroom would eventually make this very clear. But in that holding cell, he was just a man in a cage, and the system around him was operating exactly the way it had been designed to operate when it encountered men who looked like him. Derek had grown up in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta. Not the wealthy part. Not the part that gets written about in travel magazines. He had grown up in a single-parent household with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who worked 3 until the third one put him in an early grave. Derek had been sharp since childhood, the kind of sharp that teachers sometimes recognized and sometimes resented. He had earned a scholarship to Morehouse, then a full ride to Georgetown Law, where he graduated 3rd in his class. He had clerked for a federal judge in the 11th Circuit. He had worked years as an assistant United States attorney, prosecuting organized crime and public corruption cases, with a conviction rate that made older attorneys uncomfortable in the way that excellence sometimes does. Years ago, Derek Thompson had been appointed to a position that most people in the room would have never guessed existed. Special Investigative Counsel to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, Office of Police Accountability. His specific mandate, his very specific, very classified mandate, was to build prosecutable federal cases against law enforcement agencies engaged in systematic evidence planting, civil rights violations, and organized corruption. He had been investigating the Macon Police Department for years. He had been investigating Brad Collins for most of those months. In the holding cell, one of the other inmates, the young terrified one, asked Derek what he was in for. Planted evidence, Derek said. The kid nodded slowly like this was not a surprising answer. You got a lawyer? I have access to one. Public defender? No, Derek said. Not a public defender. He did not say more than that. He sat in the buzz of the fluorescent lights and waited. The Macon District Attorney's office was run by a man named Harold Bennett. a career politician who had been DA for years and had the kind of well-tailored confidence that comes from never having lost anything that mattered. Harold was tall, silver-haired, and possessed of a handshake so firm it bordered on aggression. He was not a stupid man, but he was a man who had made his peace with the machinery of his office, including the parts of the machinery that bent. Harold's lead prosecutor on drug cases was a woman named Carla Ruiz, efficient, razor-precise, with a reputation for high conviction rates that she protected with the ferocity of someone who understood exactly how much those numbers meant to her career. Carla was not corrupt in the way that Brad Collins was corrupt. She was corrupt in a subtler, more common way. She believed what the police told her, asked few questions that might complicate the answers, and defined justice largely as winning. When Carla received the file on Derek Thompson, she reviewed it quickly. 40 grams of cocaine found in the vehicle. Clean chain of custody documentation. Brad and Scott were always meticulous about their paperwork, another reason they had never been caught. The defendant had no prior, which Carla noted briefly as unusual, but not disqualifying. She set bail at a number that would be difficult for most people to meet and scheduled arraignment for later. Nobody at the DA's office ran Derek Thompson's name through the federal databases. Nobody called his employer. Nobody asked why a man with no criminal record was driving through the Riverside district with 40 grams of cocaine in his glove compartment. Nobody asked why the rental car agreement in his name showed no prior issues with the vehicle. They saw what they expected to see and moved forward with the efficiency of a system that had learned long ago that asking certain questions was bad for throughput. Meanwhile, Derek Thompson had made one phone call from the holding cell. He called a number in Washington, D.C. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. Her name was Sandra Brooks, and she was the deputy director of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Her voice, when she heard Derek's voice, shifted from professional to something more alert. "Tell me," she said. "It happened," Derek said. "Collins and Riley, exactly as we expected, exactly as documented in the previous cases." A pause. "Are you all right?" "Completely. I need you to let it run. Do not make any calls to the DA's office. Do not send anyone. Let it go to arraignment and let it go to trial if it gets there." Another pause, longer this time. "Derek, that could be. I know what it could be. Let it run. I need them comfortable." Sandra Brooks was quiet for seconds. "You have everything you need. I have everything I have had for years. I just need a courtroom." He hung up. He sat back down on the holding cell bench. He folded his hands. He waited. Derek Thompson appeared in courtroom 7 of the Bibb County Superior Court for his arraignment. He was wearing the clothes he had been arrested in, slightly rumpled, and he had declined the public defender who had been assigned to him, electing instead to represent himself pro se, which caused the clerk who processed the paperwork to raise an eyebrow, but say nothing. The presiding judge at arraignment was the Honorable Evelyn Cole, known for her impatience with theatrical lawyers and her meticulous adherence to procedure. She had seen everything, or believed she had. Carla Ruiz stood at the prosecution table, looking crisp and prepared. Brad Collins sat in the gallery behind her, still wearing that quiet smirk. Scott Riley was beside him, scrolling his phone until a bailiff told him to put it away. Derek stood at the defense table alone. Judge Cole looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Thompson, you have elected to represent yourself at this proceeding." "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand that you have the right to counsel?" "I do." "And you are waiving that right?" "For today's proceeding, yes. I will be securing representation before trial." Cole looked at him for a beat longer than standard. There was something in the way the defendant stood. Not defiant, not nervous, just composed in a way that did not quite fit the room's expectations of him. She made a small mental note and moved on. The charges were read. Possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. Derek entered a plea of not guilty. Carla moved for the bail figure she had already set. Derek did not contest it, which was odd, because the bail figure was high. Most defendants at this point would be scrambling, calling family, calculating what a bondsman would cost, doing the math on how long they could survive in a cage. Derek simply said, "I will post the full amount by end of business, Your Honor." Carla Ruiz turned to look at him. Judge Cole looked at him. Even the court reporter, a middle-aged woman who had worked this court for years, looked up from her stenography machine. Brad Collins's smirk slipped exactly 1 degree. Derek Thompson paid the full cash bail by late afternoon and walked out of the Bibb County Correctional Facility into the thin sunlight. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, straightened his coat, and called a number on his personal cell phone. A different phone than the one that had been confiscated during booking, because Derek Thompson carried 2 phones always. "I am out," he said. "Start preparing the filings. We are about 3 weeks from the end." What happened between Derek Thompson's arraignment and his trial was not visible to anyone in Macon. It was happening in Washington, D.C., in secure federal offices with sealed door protocols, and in a rented conference room in a law firm in Atlanta that had been swept for listening devices twice before the first meeting. The attorney Derek had secured, the one he told Judge Cole he would be finding, was a man named Vic Riley. Vic Riley was semi-retired and one of the most decorated civil litigation attorneys in the southeastern United States. He had argued cases before the Supreme Court. He had a reputation for surgical cross-examination that former opponents described consistently and with a kind of traumatized reverence as like being autopsied while still alive. Vic Riley had also been Derek's mentor at Georgetown Law years ago, when Vic sat down across from Derek in that conference room in Atlanta and opened the case file that Derek slid across the table. He was quiet for a long time, not because he was surprised, but because he was reading carefully, the way a surgeon reads a scan before picking up a scalpel. The file contained years of documentation. It was organized into 7 sections. The first section covered the history of Brad Collins and Scott Riley, their careers, their commendation records, and their disciplinary history, including the complaints that had disappeared, and the sealed internal affairs file. The second section contained surveillance data, vehicle movements, phone records obtained through federal warrant, and timestamp photographs. The third section contained the sworn testimonies of 11 previous defendants, black men and 1 black woman, who had been arrested by Collins and Riley on drug charges that Derek's investigation had identified as almost certainly involving planted evidence. 4 of those defendants had already served portions of prison sentences. 2 were still incarcerated. Section 4 was a forensic analysis of the drug evidence chain of custody in 8 cases, including Derek's, conducted by a federal laboratory. The analysis identified a specific batch marker in the cocaine used in 3 different cases, separated by months, meaning the drugs planted in 3 different defendants' vehicles had come from the same source. Section 5 was financial. Brad Collins had a savings account that did not match his salary. A lake house purchased in his wife's maiden name. His daughter's tuition at a private college paid in full through an LLC that forensic accountants had traced through layers of corporate paperwork to a mid-level drug distributor named Calvin Hayes, who operated in the Riverside district of Macon. Section 6 was the operational record of Derek's own investigation, including the arrest, documented in advance, the route he had driven, deliberately selected, The rental car deliberately chosen and rented under his own name to create a clean paper trail. The taillight inspected and verified functional before he set out. The body camera he had been wearing, disguised as a lapel pin, that had recorded Brad Collins's approach, the entirety of the traffic stop, and the minutes in which Scott Riley had been alone on the passenger side of the vehicle. Section 7 was the federal charges already drafted, reviewed and approved by senior DOJ attorneys, awaiting only the completion of the state trial to ensure that every piece of evidence had been introduced into the public record under oath before the federal hammer dropped. Vic Riley closed the file. He looked at Derek for a long moment. "You let them arrest you?" "Yes." "You let them put you in a cage for hours?" "I know." "Why did you not identify yourself the moment they approached the car?" Derek was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. "Because 11 people before me did not have the option I had. They could not identify themselves as federal officers and make the problem go away. They just went to jail. So I needed to understand completely, personally in my body, what they experienced. And I needed a courtroom where everything these men have done would be put on record under oath, in public, not in a sealed federal filing, in public, where every person in this city can see it." Vic Riley looked at him for another long moment. Then he opened the file again. "Tell me when you want to start," he said. The trial of the state of Georgia versus Derek Thompson began in Bibb County Superior Court. Courtroom 12 of the Bibb County Superior Court held approximately 90 spectators in its gallery. On the day the trial opened, nearly every seat was filled. This was unusual for a drug possession case. Word had gotten around. Not about who Derek really was, because that information was still sealed, but about the fact that this defendant had paid the full cash bail without blinking, that he had walked into the arraignment without a lawyer, and seemed completely untroubled by it, and that the attorney now sitting beside him was Victor Riley, whose face had been on the cover of legal reviews multiple times. Brad Collins was in the gallery again, suit and tie today. Less smirk, more surveillance. He was watching Derek and Vic Riley with the quiet attention of a man who had begun to wonder, just barely, if something was slightly off. Scott Riley was not in the gallery. He had called in sick that morning with what he told the desk sergeant was a stomach bug. The desk sergeant had not asked follow-up questions. Judge Evelyn Cole presided. Carla Ruiz prosecuted. Vic Riley defended. The trial opened with the prosecution laying out its case with usual precision. The stop, the discovery, the chain of custody, the lab analysis confirming cocaine. She called Corporal Ethan Parker to testify about the booking procedure. She called a forensic chemist from the state crime lab who confirmed the substance was cocaine hydrochloride, approximately 41 grams, consistent with intent to distribute quantities. Vic Riley's cross-examination of Parker was brief, almost bored. His cross of the chemist was precise and technical, asking about the batch analysis methodology in a way that confused Carla and seemed to bore the jury, though 2 jurors were watching with sharper attention than they had been showing all day. As the courtroom emptied after the first session, Brad Collins found Carla Ruiz in the corridor. "What is Riley doing?" Brad asked. "His job," Carla said with the slight irritation of someone who does not enjoy being questioned by witnesses. "Slow down. Do not get paranoid. I am not paranoid. You will take the stand tomorrow. Tell the same story you have told before. It always works." Brad nodded. He walked to the elevator, but as the doors closed, the smirk was gone entirely. Brad Collins took the stand. Carla walked him through the arrest with practiced smoothness. The traffic stop, the tail light. He was specific and confident about the tail light, the pat-down, the discovery of the drugs. He was good on the stand, years of experience, the easy authority of a man accustomed to being believed. The jury watched him the way juries watch cops, with a baseline of deference that prosecutors understand and count on. Then Vic Riley stood up. He stood slowly, the way older men stand when they are conserving energy for something that matters. He walked to the podium. He set down a single sheet of paper. He looked at Brad Collins for a moment without speaking, in the way that skilled cross-examiners sometimes do, letting the witness wonder, letting the room's attention sharpen. "Detective Collins," Vic said, and his voice was completely, almost unnervingly calm. "You testified that you observed a broken taillight on my client's vehicle at the time of the stop. That is correct. And that broken taillight was the basis for the traffic stop." "Yes." Vic picked up the sheet of paper. "I am going to enter Defense Exhibit A, a certified maintenance and inspection record from the rental agency, confirming that the vehicle rented by my client was inspected and all external lights were in full working order hours before the stop." He handed the exhibit to the clerk. Carla was already on her feet. "Objection, Foundation. The exhibit includes the signature of the certified mechanic and a notarized statement." "Foundation is established, Your Honor." Cole looked at the document. "Overruled." Vic turned back to Brad. "In light of this inspection record, can you explain why the taillight was broken?" Brad's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lights can break between an inspection and an encounter. It happens all the time." Vic nodded slowly. "It happens," he said, setting down the paper. "Detective Collins, during the stop, you conducted a pat-down of my client. Is that correct?" "For officer safety, yes." "And during that pat-down, your partner, Detective Riley, was positioned on the passenger side of the vehicle. He was securing the perimeter. He was alone on the passenger side of a stopped vehicle for several minutes. He was doing his job." Vic reached down and picked up a tablet. "Defense Exhibit B, Your Honor. I would like to display a video recording." Carla was on her feet again. "Objection." "The defense has not previously disclosed this was disclosed in the exhibit list filed with the court this morning. Exhibit B described as audio-visual recording of the traffic stop event. The prosecution received that filing." Cole looked at Carla. "Counsel, did you receive the exhibit list?" Carla's composure flickered for the first time. "I received it, Your Honor, but I have not." "The exhibit is admissible." "Proceed, Mr. Riley." The court's display screen lit up. The footage was clear. The angle was from Derek's own chest, pointed slightly downward and to the right toward the passenger window of the Audi. The timestamp ran, and for several minutes, Scott Riley could be seen moving around the passenger side of the vehicle. At one point, Scott leaned into the passenger window. His hand moved toward the glove compartment. He opened it. His hand went in. His hand came out. The glove compartment closed. Moments later, Brad Collins walked around to the passenger door and opened it. He leaned in. He straightened up. His face turned partially toward the camera he did not know existed, wearing an expression that was trying very hard to look like surprise. The courtroom was completely silent. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman inhaled sharply. Brad Collins on the witness stand had gone the color of old paper. "Detective Collins," Vic Riley said, and his voice was completely, almost unnervingly calm. "Can you identify the man placing an object in my client's glove compartment?" Brad said nothing. "For the record, Detective, is that your partner, Scott Riley?" The room was still holding its breath. "I want a lawyer," Brad Collins said. The courtroom erupted. Judge Evelyn Cole needed her gavel 3 times before the noise subsided to the level where she could speak and be heard. When it finally did, she looked at Carla Ruiz with an expression that contained multitudes. confusion, professional discomfort, and something that was rapidly becoming alarm. "Counsel," she said to Carla, "do you want a recess?" Carla Ruiz was standing at her table looking at the frozen frame on the display screen, Scott Riley's hand at the edge of the glove compartment, with the expression of someone who has just realized that the building they are standing in is not the building they thought it was. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone who appeared to be experiencing the slow-motion collapse of her professional assumptions. "The people request a recess." 30 minutes, Cole said. She struck her gavel. "This court is in recess." She stood, and before she walked to her chambers, she looked at Derek Thompson for a longer beat than before. The still water, the composed face. Something in her expression shifted, though she said nothing. The gallery emptied in the controlled chaos of 100 people, all trying to make phone calls at the same time. Vic Riley leaned toward Derek and said very quietly, "Ready?" "Almost," Derek said. During the recess, two things happened simultaneously. In the courthouse corridor, Brad Collins called Scott Riley. The call went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time, and this time a different voice answered. A voice Brad did not recognize, calm and professional, that said, "This is Special Agent Kevin Armstrong of the FBI's Civil Rights Unit. Detective Riley is in federal custody. Is this Detective Collins?" Brad hung up. He stood in the courthouse corridor with his phone in his hand, and for the first time in a very long time, Brad Collins felt afraid. In Harold Bennett's office on the 4th floor, Carla Ruiz was on her phone with the DA himself, speaking in the clipped low tones of someone delivering news they are still processing. Harold Bennett, for his part, was very still in his large leather chair, asking short, precise questions and receiving answers that made his silver hair seem somehow to have gone slightly grayer. When court reconvened, Carla Ruiz stood and said something that she had likely never said in years of prosecution. "Your Honor, the people move to dismiss all charges against the defendant." Judge Cole looked at her for a beat. "On what grounds?" "Evidence tampering. The integrity of the arrest has been compromised." "The motion to dismiss is granted," Cole said. She paused. She looked at Vic Riley. "Mr. Riley, any objection?" "No objection to dismissal, Your Honor." Vic paused. "However, the defense has an additional motion." "I will hear it." Vic Riley placed both hands on the podium. "Your Honor, we move that the court receive into evidence the full investigative file compiled over the past years by my client." He paused. And this was the pause that every person in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. "Special Investigative Counsel. Ishi Derek A. Thompson of the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room in which something structural had just shifted. Like the moment after an earthquake when everything has stopped moving. But nothing is the same as it was. Judge Cole's reading glasses came off her nose slowly. She looked at Derek Thompson. The defendant is a federal officer. Derek stood. He had been waiting for this moment for years, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was quieter than that, more settled. The expression of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "Special Investigative Counsel, yes, Your Honor. My identification and credentials are in Defense Exhibit C, along with a letter from the Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, confirming my appointment and the mandate of my investigation." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the documents. They were passed to the clerk. They were handed to Judge Cole. She read them in silence while the entire courtroom watched her face change. Then she set the documents down on her bench, and she looked out at the gallery, and she found Brad Collins sitting 4 rows back with his hands on his knees, and his face completely empty of its smirk. And she said in a voice that was entirely controlled but contained something hard as granite underneath, "Bailiff, please detain Detective Collins." The days that followed moved with the speed of things that have been building for a long time and finally have no more resistance. Brad Collins was arrested in courtroom 12. He was handcuffed in the same courtroom where he had been expecting to watch Derek Thompson convicted. He was walked past the gallery, past the spectators who had come for an ordinary drug trial and were leaving with something they would be talking about for the rest of their lives, in a silence that was more devastating than any noise could have been. Scott Riley, as Brad had already discovered, had been picked up by the FBI's team before court had even reconvened at his apartment complex on the south side of Macon. Scott had answered his door in a bathrobe, under the impression that it was the building superintendent. It was not. He had not reportedly said anything for the first minutes of federal custody, and then had said quite a lot. The DA's office began its internal review. Harold Bennett issued a statement announcing that his office was cooperating fully with federal investigators and conducting a comprehensive review of all drug cases prosecuted in recent years that had originated with arrests by Collins and Riley. The statement did not mention that Harold had been told privately by an FBI liaison that the review was not optional, and that his own office's handling of potentially tainted evidence was also being examined. Carla Ruiz was not named in any initial releases, but Carla Ruiz, sitting in her office that evening after everyone else had left, looking at the case files she was now seeing differently, the ones she had taken at face value, the ones she had processed through the machinery without asking the questions she should have asked, was doing her own accounting, and the accounting was not coming out in her favor. She would later cooperate with federal investigators and testify against Collins and Riley. She would later acknowledge in a sworn deposition that she had pursued convictions with a willful incuriosity about their foundations. She would lose her position at the DA's office. She would not be criminally charged. This was the subject of considerable debate. In the Riverside district of Macon, a man named Calvin Hayes, the mid-level drug distributor connected to Brad Collins's lake house financing, was arrested by a joint FBI and DEA task force at a warehouse. He had been cooperating with federal investigators under a proffer agreement for months. The cooperation had begun when Derek Thompson's investigation had identified him and offered an arrangement. Full disclosure in exchange for a reduced sentence. Calvin Hayes, who was a pragmatic man, had taken the deal. It was one of the evidentiary foundations of the financial section of Derek's file. The tally of arrests directly connected to Derek Thompson's investigation stood at Brad Collins, Scott Riley, and several other officers whose names had emerged from Scott's cooperation and Calvin Hayes' testimony. A further arrest came. A police captain named Robert Voss, who had been for years the administrative architectures that made it possible for the Collins operation to function without internal affairs interference. It was Robert Voss who had sealed the original internal affairs file on Collins. It was Robert Voss whose retirement account contained unexplained deposits. It was Robert Voss who, upon being arrested at his home in a gated community in the northwest suburbs of Macon, reportedly sat down on his front porch steps and wept. The case that Derek Thompson had built, years of documentation, the financial trail, the forensic analysis, the body camera footage, was submitted in its entirety to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The federal charges against Brad Collins alone numbered multiple counts, including civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy, drug distribution, facilitation, and wire fraud. The previous defendants, whose cases were identified as potentially tainted, including several who had served prison time and others who were still incarcerated, had their cases referred for immediate review by the Georgia Innocence Project and a special federal review panel. After Derek's trial, some of the incarcerated men were released pending full case reviews. Their names, which deserve to be said clearly, were Darius Williams, who had served months of a sentence, and Malik Johnson, who had served more than a year of another sentence. Darius Williams' mother, a woman named Tina Williams, gave a brief statement outside the correctional facility on the day her son walked out. She said only, "I never stopped believing he was telling the truth." Then she held her son and did not say anything else for a long time. The federal trial of Brad Collins began after his arrest and lasted weeks. Vic Riley was not the lead attorney in that trial. Federal prosecutors do not typically work with defense attorneys in that role, but he was present, seated in the gallery, watching with the patient attention of a man who has already done his part. Derek Thompson testified over 2 sessions, calm, precise, comprehensive, laying out the architecture of his years-long investigation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had spent his career understanding how to make juries understand complicated things. Brad Collins' defense team worked hard. They argued entrapment, that Derek had manufactured a situation to ensnare their client. The argument did not survive contact with the video evidence, the financial records, the forensic batch analysis connecting separate drug plant cases, and Scott Riley's cooperation testimony, which was detailed and specific and devastating in the way that testimony from a co-conspirator who has made peace with his fate tends to be. Brad Collins was convicted on most counts. The jury deliberated for hours. When the verdict was read, Brad Collins stood at the defense table, and his face was completely still. Not composed the way Derek's face was composed, but emptied out. The expression of a man from whom something fundamental has been removed. He had spent years protected by the weight of institutional authority, by the predictability of a system that treated certain men's testimony as gold and other men's as suspect. For years, the machinery had worked, and now the machinery was looking at him. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. Scott Riley, who had cooperated and testified, received a reduced sentence. Robert Voss was sentenced to years. Harold Bennett was not charged but was not reelected. He announced before the election that he would not be seeking another term. The statement cited a desire to spend more time with family. Nobody who read it believed that was the reason, including presumably Harold Bennett. In the sentencing statement for Brad Collins, the federal judge said something that was widely quoted and reprinted. He said the defendant spent years using the authority of his badge to treat certain citizens as targets rather than as people deserving of protection. He relied systematically on the assumption that those targets would lack the resources, the credibility, or the power to hold him accountable. He was, in that assumption, catastrophically wrong, and the weight of that error will be measured in the years he now spends in a federal prison. Years that bear no relationship to the years that Darius Williams and Malik Johnson and others lost. Brad Collins was taken from the courtroom by federal marshals. His wife, seated in the gallery, did not look up from her lap. His daughter, who had been in the courtroom every day, stood and walked out before the marshals reached the door. She did not look back. After the trial, several things happened that did not make headlines, but mattered. Darius Williams enrolled in a community college in Atlanta, studying business administration. He was starting over with the particular determination of someone who understands exactly what they are starting over from. A nonprofit connected to the Georgia Innocence Project provided partial tuition support. Darius also filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Macon and the Macon Police Department, represented pro bono by a civil rights firm in Atlanta. The suit settled for a substantial amount. Malik Johnson was older by the time his full exoneration was complete. He had worked as an electrician before his arrest. After his release, he returned to that work. His employer, a small electrical contracting company in Macon, run by a man named Pete Morrison, had held his position open on the basis that he had never believed the conviction. Pete Morrison later told a reporter that he had hired Malik back the same week the exoneration came through, and that Malik had shown up on Monday morning and worked a full day without saying much about any of it. "That is just who Malik is," Pete said. Tina Williams, Darius's mother, became a central figure in a Macon community organization called the Alliance for Justice in Policing, which had existed before the Collins case but grew considerably in the aftermath. She gave interviews. She attended city council meetings. She was, by the accounts of everyone who encountered her, formidable. Derek Thompson continued his work with the DOJ Civil Rights Division. The Macon case became a template studied, analyzed, referenced in federal training materials as a model for how systematic evidence planning could be documented and prosecuted. Derek gave one interview to a national publication in which he was asked how he had endured the hours in the holding cell knowing who he was and what he knew. His answer, which was run as a pull quote, was, "I endured it because 11 people before me endured it without the option of ending it when they chose. The least I could do was understand what they went through. The most I could do was make sure it mattered." He declined all subsequent interview requests. The body camera footage, the minutes of Scott Riley placing the evidence, was viewed millions of times on various platforms within the first week of its public release. A legal commentator called it one of the most consequential pieces of body camera footage in the history of American policing cases. This was possibly an overstatement, but it was also possibly not. The Macon Police Department underwent a federal consent decree that mandated independent oversight, mandatory body camera policies, and a complete restructuring of its internal affairs division. The implementation was slow, contested at every stage by various institutional interests, and imperfect. It was also, by most accounts of those who watched it closely, more than had ever happened before. Derek Thompson returned to Macon for the first time since the verdict. He came quietly, without announcement. He drove through the Riverside district, not in a rented Audi this time, in his own car, a gray Ford Explorer that had many miles on it and a crack in the passenger side sun visor. He drove down Poplar Street past the intersection with 9th, and he stopped for a moment at the red light. He sat there for the length of one full light cycle. Then he drove on. What he was thinking during those minutes, he never said. Maybe there was nothing that needed to be said about it. Some reckonings are private. Some justice is internal. The kind you carry in your body, rather than announce from a podium. He drove out of the Riverside district and onto the highway, and the fog-wrapped streets of Macon disappeared in his rearview mirror, and he went home. There is something important to say about this story that is not contained in the verdicts or the headlines or the millions of views of the footage. 11 people, 11 real, specific, breathing human beings had been arrested by Brad Collins and Scott Riley and placed in cages and processed through a system that treated their denials of guilt as noise and their convictions as metrics. Darius Williams had lost months. Malik Johnson had lost more. The other 9 had lost various portions of various years, probations, records, jobs they could not get, housing they could not qualify for, family structures that had shifted under the weight of absence in ways that do not reverse when a court filing says they should. A federal review panel identified that the financial and professional damage done to the 11 identified victims totaled in aggregate millions in lost wages, legal costs, incarceration costs, and downstream economic effects. This figure does not include the unquantifiable, the weight of being disbelieved, the erosion of faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect you, the particular exhaustion of being the kind of person the system treats as a target. Brad Collins, in his years in federal prison, would have time to consider what he had done. Whether he used that time for genuine reckoning or for the construction of narratives that made him the victim of his own story is a question nobody outside his cell can answer. People who knew him said he had always been good at constructing those narratives. They said he had the specific talent of a man who has convinced himself completely and almost sincerely that his version of events is the true one. Whether years is enough to dismantle that kind of self-deception, nobody knows. Scott Riley, at his reduced sentence with parole possible, had reportedly requested from within the federal facility a meeting with Darius Williams' attorney. The request was passed along. Darius Williams' attorney forwarded it to Darius. Darius's response was brief. Not yet. Not yet is not never. It is also not forgiveness. And nobody with any sense would ask Darius Williams to move faster towards something he will arrive at on his own terms, or not at all. Carla Ruiz went into private practice, handling real estate contracts and estate planning. She was not the villain of this story in the clean, simple sense. She was something more uncomfortable than a villain. She was a person who had had every opportunity to see what was in front of her, and had chosen consistently and professionally not to look. Her cooperation with federal investigators at the end had been genuine in the sense that she had answered every question fully and truthfully, once the alternative was no longer viable. Whether that counted as moral redemption or merely as pragmatic self-preservation was a question she was presumably spending her evenings working on. Harold Bennett took a position at a private law firm handling corporate compliance. He gave no interviews. Robert Voss was in a federal correctional facility. He had, by the accounts of prison staff who spoke anonymously to a journalist writing a follow-up piece later, become something of a quiet presence in the facility. Not a troublemaker, not a leader, just a man sitting with the weight of what he had enabled. He had requested access to the mental health counseling program. He had been granted it. The lake house in Tennessee that Brad Collins had purchased under his wife's maiden name, the one whose existence was a key piece of Derek's financial investigation, was liquidated as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings. The proceeds went in part to a restitution fund for the identified victims. Darius Williams received a check. Malik Johnson received a check. So did the others. The checks were, by the standards of what had been taken from them, small. Money always is in these situations. The law does its best, which is better than nothing and worse than enough. This story happened because one man refused to walk away from the truth. For years, Derek Thompson could have filed his report from a safe distance. He could have built the case without putting himself in a cell. He chose differently. He chose to understand in his body, and not just his mind, what Darius Williams and Malik Johnson and others had experienced. And in doing so, he built something that no amount of institutional inertia could ignore. Brad Collins sat in that courtroom believing he had already won. He had won before by the accounting of his victims. He had every reason to believe he would win again. He forgot one thing, that the man sitting in those handcuffs had been building the case against him for longer than he could imagine. In the end, this story reminds us that true justice is not handed down from on high by those who wear badges or sit behind benches. It is fought for, sometimes quietly and painfully, by ordinary people with extraordinary courage. Derek Thompson could have stayed safe in his Washington office, protected by his title and his authority. Instead, he chose to walk straight into the belly of the system that had broken so many lives before him. He let himself be handcuffed, stripped of dignity, and locked in a cold cell so he could feel in his own bones what 11 other men had suffered without any way out. That kind of empathy, that willingness to bleed so others might finally be heard, is rare and breathtaking. It teaches us that real change never comes from comfort or distance. It demands that we step into the pain, look it in the eye, and refuse to look away. It asks us to believe that even when the powerful smirk in the machinery seems unstoppable, one person armed with truth, patience, and unrelenting integrity can still bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who refuses to stay silent. Never doubt that justice, though slow and imperfect, still has teeth when good people decide it matters enough to risk everything. If this story stirred something deep inside you, the anger, the hope, the fierce belief that things can be better, drop a comment below and tell me, what would you be willing to endure for someone else's justice? Which part hit you the hardest? And if you want more stories that remind us why courage and truth still matter in this world, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Your support keeps these important stories alive. Thank you for being here.